Just to see a show of hands, how many of you guys have written a Node.js app that has made an API call to some other service before? Okay, so almost all the hands in the room. So all of you have dealt with a third-party integration or with a microservice before, almost all of you. And for those who haven't, hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll have seen or done your first one. Or how to not mock the internet, or how to avoid reverse engineering the internet. How many people before have accidentally reverse engineered the internet? I see 3 hands. Yeah, it takes a long time to do that. So I would like to talk to you about a few issues having to do with this, and a couple open source libraries for it, including shameless self-promotion at the end about one thing that we work on at Mishkan, which is my company. So for anybody that wants to follow along, this is the link. And I think I accidentally even left it in editing mode, but please be nice. So prologue. Why we test third-party integrations, kind of the main reason we do it. So actually, again, sure, I don't want to make any assumptions. Who in this room was not born yet in 1995? Oh my God. Okay, so there is. Yeah, I wrote my first line of code in 1995, but there you go. So what was it like writing a first line of code in 1995? So Java had just been released. Java hasn't always existed, contrary to popular belief. It did. So 1995, Bill Clinton was president, and Oasis, I checked, was the most popular band, who is British, at least in America, where I'm from. So if you were working on an app back then, there was not a really good version control solution. Git was created in 1996. So there was mostly flame wars on lists of people arguing with each other, was the version control of the epic. There was also Mercurial and a couple other things. Then Java had just been released. And there were not that many open source libraries that the community was using, probably because of a lack of proper version control. Linux kernel had, of course, just come out a few years before that. And there were very few third-party services. So actually, eBay launched in this year, and it was kind of one of the first third-party services that one could use to do anything on the internet aside from AOL, and it didn't even have an API at the time. So now, fast forward to 2019. We had to talk about errors before, so I put this up there, Sentry. So if you guys have not used Sentry.io, it is an integration that you could use to give you very nice, pleasant messages about errors in your code, even though the errors are unpleasant. If you have problems of authenticating, there's no problem. There's a third-party API for that, which is Auth0, and there's other ones too, such as Okta, AWS Cognito, Azure Active Directory, and a whole bunch of others. And then eBay still exists with a snazzy new logo. That wasn't the case in 1995, and has lots of APIs. In fact, it has a whole entire developer documentation with many different APIs. So we've moved from economy of apps that was kind of build your own to integrating with lots of third-party services just to get up and running. So in 20 years, I'm condensing that history, or 20 plus years. Man, I'm old. So Act 1, fun times with APIs. So first, I'd like to tell you guys just what I think an API is. There's different definitions of it, but I loved the point that was made before about assumptions, and I really took that to heart. So I don't want to assume that people know what APIs are. So there's a great website called Programmable Web that gives a definition of what APIs are. Application programming interfaces, so an interface that allows you that's a contract between a third-party provider or somebody just in the next room developing a microservice that says, if you interact with the thing that I made a certain way over a certain protocol, which is usually HTTP, I may or may not serve you something that you may or may not have been expecting. So that's my definition of an API, and it's up to debate. So Programmable Web lists, there you go, over 20,000 different APIs online. My favorite API that I've ever found in Programmable Web that I actually learned from somebody at a London meetup. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before, but it exists. Fuck off as a service. So that is listed. And if you're ever really mad at somebody, then you could use this API. But it's we've tracked this for a while, and it actually gets like a fair bit of usage. So that exists. But there's other nicer ones too that are on there. So APIs, Programmable Web is a great place to kind of discover, and they too have a definition of what is an API that's a little bit more scientific than the one I gave, but I did have 2 drinks tonight, so that could be where that comes from too. So the way that testing APIs works, there's several different options. Bad option 1 to test APIs is just doing nothing. For how many people, and it's okay to be honest about this, for how many people is this their option for testing third-party integrations? Awesome. Like we have at least 10 people, and I saw some people like hesitating. It's okay. You don't need to feel like shame about it. I would encourage you to embrace it. That's fine. It is a method, disabling the test, and there's a whole like economy around doing nothing and kind of cleaning up the shit after it hits the fan. There's many apps that kind of help with that, and that is a way to do it. But that is one option for testing third-party APIs. So option 2, using the real APIs. I've actually collected a lot of stories. I've been kind of an ethnographer and anthropologist about what happens when you use real APIs in a CI/CD server. And I've seen lots of great stories. So my favorite is I Want You Back, which is a company accidentally embedded a Twilio API key in their CI environment, sending a text message tens of times a day to a person in Kansas saying, I want you back with a little heart. That's so nice. What's a lot less nice, error no such user. So a company did not test JSON from an API integration, which returned error messages that just said that. And they, in a failing try-catch block, they had a finally block that still persisted that. So every single user's profile was exactly what just happened in the back. Thank you. The timing was impeccable. We planned that beforehand, and you totally nailed it. So was error no such user. So imagine like going to present to the board like the diversity of your user base, and it's you're looking at the stats, and you're like, yeah, 100% of our users have the same quality, which is error no such user. So that's exactly what happened to this unfortunate company. Then another one, somebody, as a joke, that may or may not have been me, created a username called or1=1. How many people have ever done something nasty like that? Do you guys know what's that called for those of you who have done it? Yeah, SQL injection. So don't do that. But it actually got sent repeatedly to a production API in an environment and got banned from the service. Basically, never do this. But if you put or1=1 and it's copied and pasted into SQL and it's a delete statement, then it will delete the entire database because or1=1 is always true. And you did not learn that from me, and thank God nobody's recording. You did not learn that from me. So bad option 3 is reverse engineering the APIs in your test code. So as always, there's like a Dilbert for everything. So I spent the week writing a test script for our product. How many of you guys have ever written test code that actually winds up being longer than the code you're testing? Yeah, tons of hands. And I wrote a test to test Dilbert's test script, and your script was almost perfect. Keep up the good work, buddy. So one-upsmanship exists as well in reverse engineering. But all these are bad options of testing third-party APIs. So it would be cruel if I just left you with all the bad options, and I'm not going to. There will be good ones later. But this is kind of stuff that I see out in the field all the time, and it's a way to do it, but the problem is that, this is kind of my opinion, that technology has advanced too fast with third-party APIs, which speeds us up a lot, and microservices, which speeds us up a lot, but then we have a lot of technical debt from testing. So there you go. Act 2, I'd like to talk about an open source package called Nock, to which I'm a contributor and a few of my other friends are too, and I think it's great. How many of you guys have used Nock before? Okay, great. So, and the dog in the background. All my cues are falling on. The chandelier is going to drop like Phantom of the Opera at the end of this. So I know that you guys are sticking around for that, and it will happen. So if you guys go to git clone sfno Nock, this is from a presentation I did in San Francisco, which has a small startup scene, not nearly as cool as yours. If you clone this and then do yarn test, you could see what it does. But I would like to go into the code for a little bit. Just to show what's going on under the hood of Nock. So the way Nock works is, so I'm using a jest here, but how many of you guys have used jest before? It's okay, so most hands. Otherwise, people use tape or Mocha or Jasmine or just roll their own, which is fine too. So before each, you declare with Nock what you're going to call. So here it's api.github.com. You declare what path it's going to hit. And then you say the reply that you want, and then you say what has to be in that reply. And usually that's either you manually write it or copy and paste it. Then you test something that is in theory that hopefully that path, that API call. And then you expect the thing that you copied and pasted to be the thing that you copy and paste below it. If I sound kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek about it, it's because I am. But that's how, in this case, you would use that. And then if you run it, not surprisingly, the tests pass. To get a little bit interactive about it, so there you go, all the tests pass, and there we go. So does anybody see any problems with this type of pattern of testing the GitHub API? Of writing code this way, yeah. Yeah, you hard code assumptions about the API, which could lead to false positives, or the opposite of false positive, which I have a blank on actually. True negatives, I forget. But it could lead to false positives, absolutely, in the API. Yeah, because you're making a lot of assumptions about how it works, and it requires you to read lots of documentation, and there could be lots of copy and paste errors. What else is potentially annoying about this if you're writing code kind of fast in your code base? You test the copy path? Yeah, exactly. So this path here is, another problem with it to restate is that you need to know exactly what this path is. So you need to know that your code base is looking up atom license. And if your code base is doing something where it's dynamically generating the GitHub package on the fly, then of course this is not going to work. So there's problems there too. But that said, for simple stuff, Nock is good. And where I think it's great is its comprehensiveness, which is why I've been a big fan of it for a while. So I think it makes up for those problems in that you could also do post requests. So if you log in with this, which is this data, then reply that. Again, the error, though, is that the matcher is pretty restrictive, so it needs to match exactly this data. And if in your testing code you don't log in with that data, then it won't trigger Nock, and it will actually call the real GitHub API, which could be, I mean, in this case, it wouldn't be disastrous. You would just get a 400 error. But if you're testing, like, delete all my Facebook friends, and you accidentally call the API, and you've accidentally embedded a production key, then you accidentally have no friends anymore. So, like, it's not necessarily sustainable practice. Then a couple other things that I like a lot about it. So it can delay connections and kind of do this chaos engineering type thing of like delaying connections or making connections kind of flaky. So a lot of stuff can be encoded into Nock on a test-by-test basis. And this is really what I think the genius of Nock is, as opposed to proxy servers that do the same thing. So sometimes you could have a proxy server on your machine that will have like flaky internet or that will reroute certain calls. But the problem is that it's global and it can't be fine-grained on a test-by-test basis. And you see here that in every different test, I can configure Nock in a different way every single time. So you get a lot of mileage out of that because you're able to declaratively state how you want your test to perform. So it's not perfect, but it does have a lot of nice things in there, so I would strongly recommend using it. Another nice thing about Nock that I don't show here because I'm not calling real APIs, you could record your API calls. Those are called fixtures, and then save them, and then play them back a little bit later. The problem with that is that you, if the API ever changes, or if you want to test out other data, it's kind of difficult, but it is nice because you could record stuff with Nock if you want to. So that was Act 2. Act 3, what I'd like to get to, and this is the shameless self-promotion, is a slightly different service called Unmock, one of the products that my company works on. So instead of, I don't at all claim that this is easier or better than Nock, and I think that Nock works really well in a lot of circumstances where you need to test out 1 or 2 API calls. Mostly, I'd like to show you the thinking behind this and get your feedback on what you think of it, and also if most of it's open source. So if you'd like to contribute to it, we're not necessarily hiring right now, but we are looking for open source contributors for anybody that is interested. So first, I would like to talk about Rabbinic Judaism, just because like it links into what Unmock is doing, and I feel like it's not maybe a topic that comes up a lot at Node.js meetups, but the Unmock and the name of the company is inspired by this thing in there, which is called the Mishkan, which is this kind of portable temple that was built in the book of Exodus. So the idea was that people were going to be in the desert for a long time. There was no temple that they had with them. That was kind of unfortunate. So there were instructions on how to build a portable temple that kind of sort of functioned like the actual thing, but wasn't the real thing. And then the real thing kind of happened many years afterwards. So this metaphor of a functional thing that exists just for the time you need it and then kind of disappears in a while is something that humanity has dealt with for at least as long as people were talking about this, and is something that matters a lot for API faking. So Nock, a way to think about it, is it's a small functional API that exists just for the duration of your test and then kind of disappears, right? So this idea of the Mishkan is we could say that scholars from the biblical era predicted API testing 2,000 years in advance, which is pretty darn cool. That and the end of the world. What I will talk about briefly, actually, no, let me, before I talk about how it's done, let me just do a really quick demo. The difference with Unmock, and it really depends kind of on what your use case is, So Unmock automatically picks up any API calls in your code base. So here I have a call to Behance. Here I have another call to Behance. They're kind of littered all over the code base. Here I have a call to SendGrid. So I'm not creating any mocks of these manually, but what I do is I just put import unmock, and then you start unmock. And what that will do, if it feels like starting up. So I'll just start a dev server. This is a Node server that uses Express, backed by, how many of you guys have made an Express server before? OK, so it's a pretty common pattern. I laugh when I think about Express too. No, it's an awesome tool. No, I think it's, Happy is also really nice, and there's Koa as well, which is nice. But this is an Express server used by Next.js. So we just call unmock before we actually create the server, and then it will do its thing. So what I'd like to show you is this, how it works. So this is my little fake application. I type my name. When I click submit, it's going to call SendGrid and then call Behance. But it doesn't really call any of these things. It just says, unmock, hi, we see you've called Behance. We've sent you mock data back. You could edit it here. So basically, in real time, it just intercepts all API calls and uses machine learning under the hood, well, beforehand, to learn how all the APIs work. And what we call it is passing the API Turing test. So how many of you guys have heard of the Turing test before? It's a really cool concept. So that the Turing test is the idea that you could be speaking to a computer and not know that it's a computer for like n minutes, and then the computer will have passed the Turing test for n minutes. So the idea of making an artificial intelligence that's smart enough to fool us into thinking that it's real. So our mission is to do the same thing with APIs. We use AI to create fake versions of APIs that kind of fool developers into thinking the API is real. And where that can be useful is when you're doing tests or development servers like you're doing here in order to test stuff out. So here you see that all of this content in here was created just in time and on the fly by Unmock. And if I go to any of it, all of it is kind of editable if you feel like it. So that's what I mean, that this data looks and feels like Behance looks and feels automatically without you having to like make it yourself. And that's the machine learning bit, essentially. We've just kind of learned how data is supposed to look from around 700 APIs, including like Zoom and Slack and Facebook and stuff. So it's easier than using something like Nock for that particular use case. Another thing, but this is true in Nock as well, that you could just edit stuff. We're in London, company is Condé Nast, and it will just automatically change the mock data and show up kind of in real time, which helps designers design. But to me, the real benefit of this is not the design part, although it's nice. It's the testing part, getting back to the purpose of the conversation. So testing won't look as nice because images won't show up. But in all of these tests that are going to run right here, it's just going to call unmock over and over and get the fake data, test against it, and then at that point you don't need to mock anything. So it's really good. How many of you guys have really or work with really messy applications with legacy and spaghetti code? Okay, almost 2/3 of the room. So this works really well there if you have like lots of embedded API calls kind of living in your app and are just kind of unable to keep track of them all, which is pretty common, and that's okay. Like nobody needs to feel like shame about that. That's just kind of the way the world works. And a tool like this is meant to clean up that mess. So very briefly, before ending, I will just say how we do it. So this is the open source bit that if anybody's interested in these things, we'd love to collaborate with you guys on it. All of it is like free. The only part that we charge for currently is the hosting of like anything in the background, but otherwise, if you guys like web scraping, we do a lot of that to figure out how APIs work. Recording how APIs go back and forth. Soul-crushing manual labor, if any of you guys are into that. I know that at least in the Silicon Valley, I just read an article in the New York Times that says that the new trend is like stoicism and like self-denial. So you'll be denying a lot of things. Like you'll be denying your loved ones your time. You'll be denying like minutes of your life that could be spent doing other things. When you check these specifications to make sure they're correct, but I've done a lot of it too, and it is a Zen-like experience after doing 500 of them or so. So and then the machine learning bit is super fun. And this particular meetup, it's not a machine learning meetup, but I do several of those too, where I talk a little bit about what we use under the hood to make that happen. So we're soliciting open source contributions, and if you would like to participate, yeah. So I put we're hiring back when we just filled that position. So unfortunately we're not anymore, but we are recruiting open source people, and this person is currently in Helsinki as we speak, slaving over a GPU to work on the AI bit. But that's me, and please feel free to reach out, check our code base, poke it for vulnerabilities, and if you have any questions or would like to have a beer, I'll be around afterwards. So thank you very much.